Hi, I'm Aranya. Greetings from England, and thank you for your invitation to speak at your conference. I was wondering how to start this little chat, and I thought, well, probably the best thing would be to start with gratitude, because we've inherited so much from our ancestors and we often think about the problems in the world, but I think it helps me. One of the things that I find really helpful is to focus on the gifts that our ancestors have given us, things like the fruits that we've been harvesting from our garden pretty much the whole summer, one after the other, the different varieties, the things that have been bred to grow well here in the southwest of England. And of course all the other different inventions, like the bicycle I get to ride on a regular basis, and particularly I'm very much in love with books, and I see these books very much as my tribe in a world where I feel geographically quite isolated from people of like mind. I look around me and think, what's going on? Everyone's crazy. But when I look to my books, this for me is my tribe. It's the wisdom of my tribe and my elders. And this for me is an incredible gift, because only very recently did any of us ever have the chance to own as many books as this. And for me, I see this as a store of information, a very important store of information. And stores make us feel safe. So if we start thinking about systems, and in permaculture we very much think about systems, we're looking at the world around us and we see lots of problems, and those problems are difficult to solve because we live in a world of systems. Climate change, peak oil, starvation in different countries, all of these things they're difficult to solve because they're not about one simple thing. There's a whole collection of things working together. You move this and this changes over here. We need to understand the world from a more systemic perspective in order to really have a chance of grasping what we're doing. And I think permaculture, which is something that I love, I'm inspired by, is very much something that gives us the opportunity to start seeing the world in that way. So one of the key questions for us in the world at the moment is how do we solve these problems? How do we bring more resilience into our modern world? Permaculture is very much definitely not about going back to how things were and a life of austerity. It's very much about how do we create more abundance, and how do we do it in a world that works with nature, that not just looks after nature as a separate thing over there, but works within nature as we always have been as human beings. How do we understand the world well enough to make sure that the things we do benefit nature as well as ourselves, rather than making things worse? So when we look to nature, what we're doing is we're saying, what has nature learned, what has life learned in the last 3.5 billion years? We could see it as this one giant long research and development experiment. And so there's a lot to learn from nature. Nature has a number of different secrets, if you like, that if we spend time and observe them, we can start to understand what's going on. What are the key things that life has learnt how to do that make it successful? And of course, we are part of that process too. We're only here because our ancestors and all of life around us has worked out how to do this, to live on this planet, to thrive, not just survive. So what are the principles we see? Well, there's a number of them, and there's too many to go into right now, but certainly we see a lot of diversity in the world. And of course, that's something that even in our human cultures, we're finding very difficult to manage, particularly with people moving all over the world these days. That causes all kinds of problems. And what we need to do is to stand back and say, what is the diversity for? Why do we have such diversity in the world? And of course, it's because things evolve to fit particular niches. And now we have the ability to move around so much. Many of us have traits, particularly in Britain. It's very interesting that you go out into the town centre and you see lots and lots of people walking around, and they're very different in this, that some of them have genes from Scandinavia, and some of them have them from Europe, and some have brought them from Australasia, and some from Africa, and so on. And their ancestors had developed those particular traits to help them in that given environment, and then you put those traits in a different environment, which is the modern world, and generally everything goes horribly wrong, because we have this desire to eat things, and we love sugars and fats because in nature they're very rare, and in the modern world we can have them whenever we like. And of course we see this explosion of obesity now because we're just following what is a natural trait which helped our ancestors survive, but now we're in a different context, and this is why context is also a very important thing to understand in permaculture. So when we're setting out to do permaculture, what we're trying to do is to say, okay, how do we meet our needs in the world for things like food and water and energy and so on? And at the moment, of course, most of us get those things by flicking a switch or turning a tap. And coming back to that idea that stocks make us feel safe, like this bookshelf of knowledge makes me feel safe, is that many of us don't have stocks anymore in our houses, around our homes. Most people turn on the tap, the water comes through the pipe system, have very little water stored in their home. Most people don't have batteries storing electricity in their houses. Most people, sadly, don't even have food in their cupboards anymore, or at least not enough food to get them beyond maybe a week or so. And so in permaculture, we're saying what made our ancestors successful was the fact that they had this ability. They understood the need, as the rest of nature does, to make stores for when those things run short, like food and energy stores for the winter and so on. And at the moment, we very much give the responsibility for those stores to big corporations and so on. So all the water that we have stored in the landscape is a long way away, way beyond my reach, and stored somewhere, several hundred miles halfway up a mountain, and completely under the control of a water company. Most of the food in the food stores that we have are kept in warehouses owned by supermarkets, and should I have a need for that, then I have to go to the supermarket, and if that system breaks down, then where does my food come from? So what we're trying to do in permaculture is put that resilience back. We're saying, how can we create stocks? How can we create communities of skills and important things we need within our landscape? How do we retain the good things about living now, but put some resilience back into those systems? And that's what permaculture is about. If we were to look at what permaculture is, well, this is why we take inspiration from nature, because permaculture is essentially a system that meets all its needs and produces a surplus so it can grow within its environment. And of course, that's not just about us doing permaculture, that's about nature. Life everywhere does that. And that's why we use nature as a model, as an inspiration. For me, there's a difference between permaculture and permaculture design. So permaculture design is how we go about getting from where we are now, which is a little bit vulnerable, to a place where systems both at home and in our communities and bioregionally are much more resilient. And so when we're doing permaculture design, it's about how do I get from here to where I want to be? So of course, in order to know where you're going, you need to actually sit down and say, where am I lacking? Where am I losing resources? Where are my vulnerabilities? But we also need to understand where we are. It's that context thing again. So in permaculture, we spend a lot of time observing, because we observe. It's very easy to see things quite quickly. I can walk into a woodland and see trees and birds and so on and so forth, but it takes time to start to understand the relationships between those different creatures. And so observation takes time, and yet by taking that time, we start to learn things that can help us make good interventions into the landscape. So once we've gathered all that information, then what we need to do is to play with it to make sense, if you like. And there are many tools that we use in permaculture. There's some very familiar ones perhaps to those people that have heard of permaculture. There's the permaculture ethics, which is, put very simply, care of the earth, care of people, and fair shares or sharing of surplus, or thinking of the future care, that's sometimes called. We also have principles, the principles of attitude, the way we see the world, principles of energy efficient design. Where do we place things in the landscape in order to save us lots of time walking backwards and forwards, doing regular jobs and so on. And many of these things are common sense when you think about them. But for me, what's nice about permaculture is how it brings all these things together in a very nice package. And the other principles that I've already mentioned are the principles of ecology, what we learn from nature. And they're key in order to frame what we do, to make sure that when we put something into our system, so if I'm providing food for myself, that I'm providing diversity of food that perhaps feeds me at different times of year. That's something we very much have enjoyed this summer again. It seems that as soon as one fruit ends, another one begins, which is fantastic. And we're currently on apples and soon to have cornus and so on, and raspberries, of course. But within that system, that we also have what's called response diversity. So we know that the climate is changing. If it gets colder or wetter or summer or hotter, we don't know what's going to happen. But within a system, if I'm planting things that will be happier, some things will be happier if it gets wetter, some things happier if it gets hotter, some things happier if it gets colder, and so on, then there's some resilience in there. That's very different from just having lots of things that will all die if it gets hotter, for instance. So there is these different principles that help us frame and help us make decisions about what we do. And so the book that I wrote back in 2012 is all about this process of how do we go from where we are now to where we want to be, how to observe where we are, both from a perspective of what our current situation is for ourselves, but also the landscape we inhabit, the social landscape, the physical landscapes, and so on. How do we make decisions? What tools can we use to get us to that place? And then how do we work out what to do when? So implementing our ideas, and also how do we maintain them? And so I wrote this book in order to put that all, ultimately it was for me, just to make sense of it for me, because I wanted to understand the process. But I've been delighted at the response, how popular it's become, and I'm particularly excited because now there is a Czech edition, and I'm really excited to this is the launch of this book. So I'm hoping that this makes this information much more accessible in your country, and very much wish you a fantastic conference. Thank you.